World Championship Wrestling entered 1991 as professional wrestling's clear #2 promotion. They had Sting as the young babyface of the future. They had the Four Horsemen and a deep roster of talent. They had Ted Turner's money backing them up. By every measure, they should have been positioned to challenge WWE for wrestling supremacy. Instead, they proceeded to have one of the most catastrophic years in wrestling history. By December of 1991, WCW had fired their biggest star and handed him to Vince McMahon. They had produced what many consider the worst pay-per-view in wrestling history. They had subjected audiences to some of the most ridiculous gimmicks ever conceived. And at the center of all this chaos stood a former Pizza Hut executive who genuinely wanted to transform the legendary Ric Flair into a Roman gladiator named Spartacus. This is the complete story of everything wrong with WCW in 1991. To understand how 1991 became such a disaster, you first have to understand the man running WCW. His name was Jim Herd, and his path to controlling a wrestling company was unlike anything the industry had ever seen. Herd worked as station manager at KPLR-TV in St. Louis, which happened to broadcast the legendary Wrestling at the Chase program for Sam Muchnick's territory. That was his only connection to professional wrestling. From the television station, he moved into the restaurant business, becoming a regional executive at Pizza Hut. By his own account, he was successful there, raising profits by millions through customer feedback surveys that led to putting more cheese on pizzas. He retired from the pizza business in 1988. When Ted Turner purchased Jim Crockett Promotions for approximately $9 million in November 1988, he needed someone to run his new wrestling acquisition. Through his connection with Turner executive Jack Petrick, who was also from St. Louis, Jim Herd got the job. On January 3, 1989, he became WCW's inaugural executive vice president. He had zero experience in professional wrestling as either a creative or business leader. His only tangential connection was overseeing a television station that happened to air wrestling decades earlier. Now he was in charge of the second biggest wrestling company in North America. Herd approached wrestling like any other consumer product. He wanted to impose corporate discipline on WCW's chaotic operations. He wanted to emulate WWE's family-friendly model to capture younger audiences. He believed wrestling needed to be modernized and that the old guard was holding the company back. These might have been reasonable goals if pursued by someone who actually understood what made wrestling work. Jim Herd did not understand what made wrestling work. Jim Ross, who served as both announcer and head of talent relations during this period, later reflected on Herd's tenure. Ross said that Herd just wanted somebody to talk to because he was lonely and didn't have many friends. Ross became a friend in that respect, which got him a lot of heat with the booking committee because they thought he was colluding against them. This was the man making all the major decisions for WCW heading into 1991. A former pizza executive who was so isolated that his announcer became his only friend in the company. The results would be predictable. Jim Herd's most infamous proposal targeted the company's biggest star. He wanted Ric Flair to undergo a complete transformation. The 16-time world champion, the Nature Boy, the man whose flamboyant persona had defined NWA wrestling for over a decade. Herd wanted him to cut his signature bleached blonde hair, wear an earring, and rebrand himself as Spartacus, a Roman gladiator character. This was not a joke. This was not a passing thought in a brainstorming session. Multiple people who were in those meetings have confirmed the Spartacus pitch was deadly serious. Arn Anderson confirmed the story on his podcast in December 2022. Anderson said that brilliant haircut that Jim Herd thought Flair needed was real. That was Jim Herd wanting to cut his hair, put an earring in, and call him Spartacus. Anderson followed that up by saying, Jesus Christ. Kevin Sullivan, who served on WCW's booking committee, delivered perhaps the most devastating response when the idea was pitched in a meeting. Sullivan told Herd that while they were doing this, why don't they go to Yankee Stadium and change Babe Ruth's number? Jim Ross was equally appalled. Ross called it one step away from insanity, about 2 steps away from being committed. He said it was so ridiculous that your boss had this misguided notion that you need a makeover. A total makeover. In a 2020 appearance on Conversations with Conrad, Herd denied the Spartacus idea was ever seriously considered. He claimed it emerged from brainstorming sessions. But then he suggested there had been discussion of something called the Zodiac Man gimmick. This would be a wrestler who would throw discs redeemable at fast food restaurants with his name changing monthly based on astrological signs. Whether that defense makes Herd look better or worse is debatable. The Spartacus concept was merely the most famous of Herd's terrible ideas. Consider the gimmicks that actually made it to television under his watch. The Ding Dongs debuted in 1989 and featured two masked men in latex costumes covered in bells. A giant ship's bell would ring continuously throughout their matches. Jim Cornette described Herd's pitch with characteristic colorfulness. Cornette said he heard that old antiquated piece of possum excrement Jim heard from his own thin little chicken lips, excitedly describing how there was going to be a ship's bell in the corner, and when one of the ding-dongs was in trouble, the other one was going to ring the bell, and that's the signal for the people to cheer. The Wrestling Observer newsletter awarded them Worst Gimmick of 1989. Bleacher Report later ranked them the most horrible gimmick of all time. The Hunchbacks never made television, but not for lack of trying. Herd's concept was a tag team with hunched backs who couldn't be pinned because their shoulders could never touch the mat. Cornette recalled that Jim Herd went off on a 10-minute speech about how he had come up with the greatest idea for a tag team ever: the Hunchbacks. Ole Anderson shut it down by pointing out he could simply slap an armbar on one of them and make him submit. Jim Ross brought up the same logic in another meeting, which prompted Herd to snap and say, "God damn it, you spoil everything with that logic of yours." That quote tells you everything you need to know about Jim Herd. Logic was an obstacle to his creative vision. The year 1991 began with WCW still dealing with the fallout from one of wrestling's most embarrassingly botched angles. The Black Scorpion storyline had terrorized Sting throughout the fall of 1990, with mysterious promos hinting at connections to his past. Los Angeles and California. 1986 on the beach, the distorted voice intoned. Ask Sting about Tulsa and look at his reaction. The clues pointed toward Ultimate Warrior, who was Sting's former tag partner in the Blade Runners during their UWF days in Tulsa. There was just one problem. Warrior was WWE champion with zero chance of appearing in WCW. The angle's origin was almost as embarrassing as its conclusion. Ole Anderson, who was serving as head booker, conceived the Black Scorpion as a joke during a booking meeting. After Jim Herd rejected many of his legitimate ideas, Ole sarcastically scribbled "Sting versus the Black Scorpion" on a note card. To his horror, Herd loved it and greenlit the angle immediately. Neither man had any idea who would actually be revealed under the mask. The result was chaos. Multiple wrestlers portrayed the Scorpion at different events. Ole Anderson did the distorted voice promos. Al Perez wrestled Sting at Clash of Champions 12. The Angel of Death, who was Dave Sheldon, and Sting's actual former training partner from Power Team USA, worked house shows. Various jobbers, including Bill Irwin and Moondog Rex, filled in elsewhere. The heights and weights varied wildly. The wrestling styles were completely inconsistent. Making matters worse, Herd pushed for entertainment elements. The Black Scorpion performed parlor magic tricks on television. He made a woman disappear in a spinning device. He claimed to use mind control on referees. He put a box on a man's head that swiveled around. At one point, he allegedly turned a man into a leopard. Gordon Soley was brought blindfolded to interview him in a mysterious lair. Professional wrestling had jumped the shark. At Starrcade 1990 on December 16th in St. Louis, the whole mess came to a head. The Black Scorpion descended from the ceiling in what was supposed to be a UFO or spaceship contraption, but looked more like a large industrial fan covered in tinfoil and lights. He wore a silver, glittery, sequined cape. Multiple fake scorpions accompanied him to the ring. The wrestler under the mask was Ric Flair. A decision that made zero narrative sense. Why would the flashy, self-promoting nature boy hide behind a mask and perform magic tricks? Flair had to wrestle a completely different style to hide his identity, but the St. Louis crowd immediately recognized his mannerisms and began chanting "Nature Boy" before the unmasking even occurred. WCW then botched the reveal itself. They sent Barry Windham and Arn Anderson to attack Sting before Flair was even unmasked, ruining whatever surprise remained. Cameras never got a clear shot of Flair's face. Jim Ross had to repeatedly shout, "It's Ric Flair," while the production team scrambled. Flair himself called the experience humiliating. Sting was reportedly furious, believing the angle had ruined his first world title reign. Flair later said Sting was more furious than he was. Sting believed the Black Scorpion had ruined his reign. And he was right. Ole Anderson was fired as booker immediately after Starrcade. He later blamed Dusty Rhodes for the finish, despite the fact that Dusty was still employed by WWE and wouldn't return to WCW until 2 months later. The Black Scorpion angle perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with WCW heading into 1991. They started a major storyline with no ending in mind. They put their world champion in humiliating situations. They relied on smoke and mirrors instead of actual wrestling. And when everything fell apart, they blamed each other instead of taking responsibility. This was the foundation upon which WCW built its 1991. With Ole gone, a temporary booking committee of Jim Ross, Tony Schiavone, Kevin Sullivan, and Ric Flair held things together until Dusty Rhodes was hired as head booker in January 1991. Dusty returned with the title Goodwill Ambassador for WCW after his embarrassing WWE stint in polka dots as the common man. Under this new regime, WCW continued producing terrible gimmicks at an alarming rate. Oz debuted at Super Brawl on May 19, 1991. This was a Wizard of Oz tie-in created because Turner Broadcasting had acquired television rights to the classic film. A 6'10" Kevin Nash was given silver hair and beard, neon green tights, and a goofy rubber wizard mask. His entrance featured a castle backdrop with fog and green strobe lights, while actors dressed as Dorothy, the Tin Man, Scarecrow, and Cowardly Lion led him to the ring. Kevin Sullivan played the Great Wizard in an equally ridiculous costume, wearing slacks and sneakers underneath his robes. Nash thought the gimmick was a rib to run him out of the business, but Sullivan convinced him otherwise. Brother, take the money. Nash received a $50,000 pay raise to humiliate himself on national television. After losing to Ron Simmons at Great American Bash 1991, Oz was put on a losing streak that stretched through the end of the year. He lost to Tom Zenk, Dustin Rhodes, Big Josh, Van Hammer, PN News, Bobby Eaton, Rick Steiner, Sting, and a Spider-Man knockoff called Arachnoman. The future Diesel and future multiple-time world champion was being treated as a complete joke. Ironically, the gimmick got over in Japan when Nash toured for New Japan Pro Wrestling. But in America, it was a disaster. Speaking of Arachnoman, this was Brad Armstrong in yellow and blue spandex, doing a blatant Spider-Man ripoff. It was such an obvious trademark violation that Marvel Comics threatened a lawsuit forcing WCW to quickly drop the character. How this got approved in the first place remains a mystery. Black Blood featured Billy Jack Haynes as a medieval executioner who carried an axe to the ring and attempted to behead opponents. He lost to Big Josh at Great American Bash via small package. Not exactly the finish you'd expect for a character whose entire gimmick was terrifying violence. PN News was WCW's disastrous attempt to capitalize on rap music's popularity. His raps were notoriously awful. His ring work was poor. He injured the Angel of Death at a house show, curtailing whatever push he might have received. El Gigante at 7'7" represented Turner Broadcasting's failed attempt to find an athletic use for former basketball prospect Jorge Gonzalez. When he proved too uncoordinated for the Atlanta Hawks, they tried wrestling. The results were horrific. He couldn't cut promos because he barely spoke English. His matches were unwatchable. His bouts with Sid Vicious remain some of the worst big man matches in wrestling history. Despite all evidence that he had no business in a wrestling ring, WCW gave him a face of the company push throughout 1991. They put him in main event angles. They had him save Sting repeatedly. They positioned him as some kind of superhero. Logic would have suggested featuring talented workers who could actually perform. But logic was apparently Jim Herd's enemy. The common thread running through all these gimmicks was a fundamental misunderstanding of what wrestling audiences wanted. Herd believed audiences wanted cartoon characters and spectacle. He thought wrestling needed to be more like Hulk Hogan's WWE, with bright colors and larger-than-life personalities. What he failed to understand was that WCW's audience valued in ring work and believability. They wanted athletes who could wrestle, not clowns in costumes. All of this dysfunction paled compared to what happened in the summer of 1991. Ric Flair's contract negotiations had been deteriorating for months. Herd wanted Flair to accept a pay cut from approximately $750,000 to $350,000 annually, less than half his previous salary. Beyond the money, Herd still pushed creative changes, including the Spartacus concept and a diminished role in the main event scene. Flair refused to accept both the pay cut and the character change. He was willing to drop the world title, but he wanted his contract situation resolved first. When he offered to lose the championship to Barry Windham instead of Lex Luger, believing Windham deserved the opportunity, Herd rejected the compromise. On July 1, 1991, 2 weeks before the Great American Bash pay-per-view, Jim Herd called Ric Flair and fired him. Flair offered to fly back from vacation and lose the title on television. Herd initially considered it, then changed his mind, saying he would send Doug Dillinger to retrieve the championship belt. This is where the situation went from bad to catastrophic. Under NWA rules, world champions were required to post a $25,000 security deposit to the NWA Board of Directors. This served as insurance that the champion wouldn't leave with the belt or refuse to drop it. The deposit plus accumulated interest, reportedly totaling somewhere between $38,000 and $42,000 by this point, would be returned when the champion lost the title. Flair demanded his deposit back. Herd's response, according to Flair, was a profane refusal involving the belt. Flair's reply was that Herd should watch where the belt is next Monday. Because WCW refused to return his deposit, Flair kept possession of the big gold belt as legally justified collateral. He called Vince McMahon and sent the belt to WWE. On September 9, 1991, Bobby the Brain Heenan walked onto WWE Primetime Wrestling, holding the big gold belt like a baby, proclaiming it belonged to the real world champion. Flair debuted on WWE Superstars on September 21st, wearing the belt and calling himself the real world's champion. WCW's biggest star was now advertising for the competition while holding their championship belt. All because Jim Herd refused to return a $25,000 deposit. The legal situation became complicated. Turner Broadcasting and WCW filed a lawsuit against WWE for using WCW's intellectual property. But Flair's defense was airtight. Since WCW never returned his deposit, he legally owned the belt. WWE digitally blurred the belt on broadcast to minimize trademark exposure. The situation wasn't resolved until spring 1992, when Flair finally received his $25,000 plus interest in exchange for returning the big gold belt to WCW. By then, the damage was catastrophic and permanent. With Flair gone and the belt in enemy hands, WCW had to scramble. The Great American Bash was scheduled for July 14, 1991 at the Baltimore Arena, just 13 days after Flair's firing. The advertised main event had been Ric Flair defending the World Championship against Lex Luger in a steel cage match. Now WCW had no champion, no belt, and no main event. The replacement main event was Barry Windham versus Lex Luger for the vacant WCW World Championship. Windham, who had been scheduled for a 6-person cage match elsewhere on the card, was suddenly thrust into a world title match he had no business headlining. Both men were babyfaces with no storyline conflict between them. WCW didn't even have a physical championship belt. because Flair kept the big gold belt they improvised by taking an old defunct championship from Dusty Rhodes Professional Wrestling Federation in Florida and slapping a gold-colored plate on it reading WCW World Heavyweight Champion. Close-up camera shots revealed just how cheap and hastily assembled it looked. The Baltimore crowd made their feelings known immediately. Throughout the entire show, fans chanted, "We want Flair," so loudly that announcers Jim Ross and Tony Schiavone could barely be heard. The chants reached deafening levels during the main event as fans booed both supposed heroes and made clear their contempt for the product. The show opened with a scaffold match between Bobby Eaton and PN News versus Steve Austin and Terrence Taylor. All four wrestlers refused to take the scaffold bump that typically ended such matches, so WCW hastily added a capture the flag rule to avoid anyone falling. No actual wrestling occurred on the impossibly narrow scaffold. It set the tone for what followed. The card featured Ricky Morton wrestling Robert Gibson, the Rock and Roll Express partners having a blow-off match that should have been emotionally charged but came off flat. Nikita Koloff, the heel, defeated Sting the babyface in a Russian chain match to end their feud. Backwards booking that defied basic wrestling logic. El Gigante squashed one-man gang, despite having no business in a wrestling ring. The main event saw Luger defeat Windham with a pile driver. Not even Luger's finisher, the torture rack. After Harley Race yelled "now" from ringside, signaling Luger's heel turn. The turn went largely unnoticed because the audience was so disinterested and hostile. The undercard was equally problematic. The Young Pistols defeated the fabulous Freebirds in a lumberjack match that went barely 8 minutes. Dustin Rhodes defeated Terrence Taylor in a match that existed primarily to give the Booker's son a win. Diamond Dallas Page, as a manager rather than wrestler, seconded a losing team. The entire show felt thrown together at the last minute because it literally was thrown together at the last minute. Jim Ross later said he would have to say this was the worst pay-per-view he had been a part of. It was just like a dog chasing its tail. Nothing was ever settled. The show drew approximately 7,000 fans with a 1.0 buy rate, which was roughly 90,000 purchases, among the lowest in company history. Dave Meltzer called it quite possibly the worst PPV show in wrestling history. Decades later, that assessment largely stands. One significant note about this show: it marked Eric Bischoff's debut as a WCW interviewer. The man who would eventually save the company in the Monday Night Wars era began his WCW career at arguably its lowest moment. Not every WCW pay-per-view in 1991 was a disaster. Wrestle War 1991 on February 24th in Phoenix featured a War Games match so good that Dave Meltzer called it one of the best he had ever seen live. The Four Horsemen and Larry Zbyszko defeated Sting, Brian Pillman, and the Steiner brothers in a 5-star classic. The event received a 97.3% thumbs-up rate in the Wrestling Observer newsletter reader poll, the third best in Observer poll history at that time. The undercard featured quality matches as well. The Steiners defeated Arn Anderson and Barry Windham for the WCW World Tag Team Championship. Dustin Rhodes won his first major singles match against Buddy Landel. The show proved that when WCW focused on wrestling rather than gimmicks, they could still deliver quality entertainment. But even Wrestle War had problems. During the War Games match, Sid Vicious recklessly powerbombed Brian Pillman directly onto his neck twice, temporarily paralyzing him. The match had to be stopped prematurely, with El Gigante throwing in the towel for the babyface team. Pillman's injuries would have lasting effects on his career. Sid had already developed a reputation for being dangerous in the ring, and this incident only reinforced those concerns. Super Brawl 1 on May 19th delivered solid wrestling, including a Steiners vs. Sting and Luger tag match that won Pro Wrestling Illustrated's Match of the Year award. Ric Flair defeated Tatsumi Fujinami in the main event to unify the WCW and NWA World Championships. The match was controversial because Fujinami had actually pinned Flair clean, but the referee was bumped and didn't see it. A restart led to Flair winning, which frustrated fans who wanted a clean finish. This event also featured Sid Vicious's final WCW pay-per-view appearance. He lost a stretcher match to El Gigante while the crowd sang, "Na na, hey hey, kiss him goodbye," as he departed for WWE. Most significantly, Super Brawl marked Ric Flair's last WCW main event for several years. Less than 2 months later, he was fired. The cage was so large it left no room for actual wrestling. The production team couldn't properly shoot the action, leading to the infamous refer eye camera mounted on the referee's helmet. Technology that was immediately retired after this disaster. The concept itself was absurd. Professional wrestling is built on suspension of disbelief, but asking audiences to believe that wrestlers would voluntarily strap each other into an electric chair was too much. The chair looked cheap, the special effects were unconvincing. The ghouls wandering around the cage added nothing but confusion. The botched finish saw Cactus Jack accidentally pull the switch while Abdullah was in the chair. Abdullah's electrocution selling looked completely fake. He then sprang back to life and attacked ghouls for no apparent reason. The announcers tried to sell it as dramatic, but nobody was buying what WCW was selling. Mick Foley later said that his answer whenever asked about the Chamber of Horrors is that there's a reason why there was no Chamber of Horrors 2. The rest of Halloween Havoc featured a 2 out of 3 falls match between Lex Luger and Ron Simmons that went nearly 30 minutes. It was actually a solid match, but audiences were burned out from the Chamber of Horrors disaster. The show also featured an early appearance by Johnny B. Bad, who was played by Mark Miro doing a Little Richard impersonation. Another questionable gimmick in a year full of them. Starrcade 1991 on December 29th was historically WCW's most important annual event, their equivalent of WrestleMania, the show that defined the year. But this year, it was reduced to a gimmick show. The Battle Bowl Lethal Lottery format saw 40 wrestlers randomly paired into tag teams for qualifying matches, with winners advancing to a 20-man double-ring battle royal. The concept dominated the entire card, leaving no room for traditional title matches or storyline blow-offs. Most tag matches lasted only 5 to 6 minutes with little memorable action. Wrestlers kept forgetting the rules and throwing opponents to the floor instead of the other ring. The random pairings meant there was no build-up, no storylines, and no investment from the audience. WCW actually ran 2 events on December 29th. There was a joint NJPW-WCW Starrcade show at the Tokyo Dome earlier in the day, featuring Lex Luger defending the WCW Championship against Masahiro Chono. Then the American Starrcade with the Battle Bowl format. Running 2 major shows on the same day with your world champion working in Japan showed WCW's confused priorities. Most damaging there was no World Championship match on the American Starrcade for the first time, and no Ric Flair for the first time in the event's history. The Nature Boy had been synonymous with Starrcade since its inception. His absence was felt throughout the night. Sting won the Battle Bowl, earning a title shot at Lex Luger. But the victory felt hollow on a show that critics consistently rank among the worst Starrcades ever produced. The biggest event of the year had been reduced to a random battle royal with no stakes and no meaning. Beyond Ric Flair, WCW hemorrhaged talent throughout 1991. The departures started before the year even began and continued throughout. Sid Vicious rejected a reported $750,000 guaranteed contract and a promise of a world championship run to leave for WWE. He debuted as Sid Justice on May 28, 1991. For WCW to lose both Flair and Sid in the same year was devastating. These were 2 of their 3 biggest stars alongside Sting. The Midnight Express manager Jim Cornette and Stan Lane had already departed in late 1990 after Arn Anderson's booking drove them out. They would eventually start Smoky Mountain Wrestling. The Midnight Express had been one of the greatest tag teams in NWA WCW history, and their departure left a hole in the tag division. Mean Mark Callis, who later became The Undertaker, had left in 1990 after being misused. WCW had one of the most iconic wrestlers in history on their roster and had no idea what to do with him. He went to WWE and became a legend. The Nasty Boys departed for WWE, where they would win the Tag Team Championship at WrestleMania 7. Tony Schiavone left for WWE, taking his announcing talents to the competition. The pattern was clear. Talented wrestlers were fleeing WCW for the stability and opportunity that WWE offered. Those who remained operated under what became known as the pin me, pay me mentality. After Ole Anderson's disastrous booking run, wrestlers learned that wins and losses meant nothing. What mattered was collecting paychecks. This attitude spread through the locker room like a virus. Jim Herd's unpopularity with talent was nearly universal. Jimmy Garvin called him a goof. Kevin Sullivan felt pity for Herd, but said that with Herd having no background in wrestling, he should have never been given such an important role. Dutch Mantell recalled being promised a job by Herd and then being ghosted. Wade Keller summarized the situation in a 1991 interview. He said WCW is just driving themselves into the ground. They're so mismanaged. It's just an old boys network with Dusty Rhodes and all his cronies. Jim Herd, the executive vice president, was in the pizza business before, and he was bad at that. The Great American Bash disaster crystallized the locker room's contempt. Wrestlers sympathized with Flair, and according to multiple accounts, collectively decided to phone in their performances. Every match was deliberately mediocre as a form of protest against Jim Herd. The hostile crowd chanting, "We want Flair," reflected exactly what the wrestlers were feeling backstage. The booking was also accused of favoritism. Dusty Rhodes, as head booker, pushed his son Dustin relentlessly. He pushed his friends and allies while burying wrestlers he didn't like. Ole Anderson before him had done the same thing. The lack of meritocracy destroyed morale. There were some bright spots on the arrival side. Steve Austin debuted at Clash 15 on June 14, 1991, with Paul E. dangerously proclaiming he would be the wrestler of the 90s. A prediction that would prove remarkably accurate. Austin came in as Stunning Steve and immediately showed the talent that would make him a megastar later in the decade. Rick Rude arrived in October, debuting as the Halloween Phantom and laying groundwork for the Dangerous Alliance faction that would dominate 1992. Rude was a proven main eventer who had held WWE Intercontinental Championship and would bring credibility to WCW's upper card. Ricky Steamboat returned at Clash 17 as a mystery partner for Dustin Rhodes, creating one of WCW's few genuine markout moments of the year. Steamboat was one of the greatest workers in wrestling history, and his return gave fans something to cheer about in an otherwise miserable year. His feud with Rick Rude would produce excellent matches throughout 1992, giving WCW something to build around. Dustin Rhodes received a relentless push from his father, the Booker. He went 6 wins, 0 losses, and 1 draw on major PPV and Clash cards throughout the year. A record that raised eyebrows given his relative inexperience. Lex Luger's World Championship reign was doomed from the start. He won the vacant title by defeating Barry Windham, not by beating Ric Flair, the man who actually held the championship. The crowd didn't accept him because he never conquered the mountain. His heel turn at Great American Bash went unnoticed in the hostile atmosphere. For the rest of 1991, he was a champion in name only. The makeshift championship belt from that Florida territorial title, with a WCW plate hastily attached, served as a visual reminder of WCW's incompetence every time it appeared on screen. It would take years for the world title to recover its prestige. Luger's title defenses were sparse. He retained against Ron Simmons at Halloween Havoc in a 2 out of 3 falls match. He retained against Rick Steiner at Clash 17. He faced Masahiro Chono at the Starrcade Tokyo Dome Super Show. By late 1991, Luger was sitting out his remaining contracted dates while still collecting money. He lost the championship to Sting at Super Brawl 2 on February 29, 1992, then left WCW entirely for the World Bodybuilding Federation. Meanwhile, the NWA title situation became equally chaotic. On September 9, 1991, after seeing Flair display the NWA Championship on WWE television, the NWA board held an emergency meeting and stripped Flair of the title. It was the first time in almost 50 years that the historic NWA Championship was vacant. The lineage dating back to 1948 was effectively destroyed by Jim Herd's refusal to return a $25,000 deposit. WCW's business performance in 1991 told the story of a company in freefall. Pay-per-view buy rates declined throughout the year. WrestleWar drew approximately 105,000 buys. Super Brawl performed best with around 125,000 buys. Great American Bash collapsed to roughly 90,000 buys with its 1.0 buy rate. Halloween Havoc fell further to about 75,000 buys at a 0.8 rate. Starrcade, historically WCW's crown jewel, managed only 179,000 buys. Better than the mid-year disasters, but far below the event's historical performance. For comparison, WWE's WrestleMania 7 drew 400,000 buys with a 2.8 buy rate, nearly 4 times WCW's best 1991 number. House show attendance told a similar story. The January 30th Clash of Champions drew only 2,200 fans, generating a $16,000 gate. WrestleWar pulled 6,800 fans for a $53,000 gate. Super Brawl drew 6,000 fans for a $76,000 gate. The September Clash managed just 2,800 fans for a $28,000 gate. Television ratings for Clash of Champions events hovered between 3.7 and 4.3. Decent numbers propped up by Turner's cable distribution, but nowhere near competitive with WWE programming. WCW reportedly lost between $5 and $7 million in 1990 under Ole Anderson's booking, and the bleeding continued throughout 1991. Only Ted Turner's deep pockets kept the company alive. A normal business operating with these losses and this level of dysfunction would have folded. WWE exploited WCW's weakness at every opportunity. They had consistent booking with clear direction. They protected their top stars instead of firing them over ego battles. They delivered clean finishes instead of dusty finishes. They created memorable characters instead of disasters like Oz and the Ding Dongs. When Ric Flair arrived on WWE television holding the big gold belt and calling himself the real world's champion, it was the ultimate humiliation. WCW's greatest asset, advertising on their competitors' programming. The damage from 1991 extended far beyond that calendar year. Jim Herd resigned in January 1992, unable to continue after the talent exodus, bad press, poor ratings, and low house show attendance. One historical account noted he tried to bring a corporate structure to the federation, but the bookers he hired would bury any wrestler that Herd hired by squashing them in matches against wrestlers hired by the bookers. His replacement, Kip Allen Frey, was a Turner lawyer with equally little wrestling experience. Bill Watts arrived in March 1992 with old-school rules that alienated fans, including banning top rope moves. The revolving door of leadership continued until Eric Bischoff finally took over in 1993. Flair didn't return to WCW until February 1993. Nearly 2 years of the company's history passing without its defining star. Sting's credibility damaged by the Black Scorpion debacle never fully recovered to 1990 levels. Brian Pillman's injuries from Sid's reckless powerbombs had lasting effects. The locker room had learned at Great American Bash that they could phone in performances with no consequences. The creative bankruptcy was perhaps most damaging. Oz, Black Blood, Arachnoman, the Chamber of Horrors, the Battle Bowl Lethal Lottery. These weren't isolated mistakes, but symptoms of leadership that fundamentally misunderstood professional wrestling. When Bischoff finally took over, he had to rebuild from scratch. It took until the signing of Hulk Hogan in 1994 and the New World Order angle in 1996 for WCW to fully recover from 1991's self-inflicted wounds. The company lost nearly 5 years of momentum because a former Pizza Hut executive wanted to call Ric Flair Spartacus and couldn't be bothered to return a $25,000 deposit. The seeds of WCW's eventual destruction in 2001 were planted in 1991. The pattern of incompetent leadership, alienated talent, and creative bankruptcy would repeat itself under different management until the company finally collapsed. But for sheer concentrated disaster, no year matched 1991. What makes 1991 so instructive is how preventable it all was. Returning Ric Flair's deposit would have cost $25,000. Keeping him happy with his existing contract would have cost $750,000 annually. Instead, WCW lost millions in revenue, credibility, and goodwill. They handed their biggest star and their championship belt to Vince McMahon. They spent years recovering from wounds that were entirely self-inflicted. The same pattern would repeat in the late 1990s. WCW would once again let ego and incompetence drive away their biggest stars. They would once again make baffling creative decisions. They would once again prioritize cost-cutting over quality. And in 2001, they would finally pay the ultimate price when Vince McMahon purchased the company for a fraction of what Ted Turner had paid in 1988. But that is a story for another time. In 1991, WCW still had a decade of life left in it. They would eventually find their footing under Eric Bischoff. They would sign Hulk Hogan and create the New World Order. They would win the Monday Night Wars for 83 consecutive weeks. They would prove that a competently run WCW could challenge and even defeat WWE. None of that success erases what happened in 1991, the year that WCW seemed determined to destroy itself, and very nearly succeeded in doing exactly that. Like and subscribe for more WCW content. Until next time.